Okay, so I want to give us a running start into tonight's material. So remember, at the end of the early church period in the late 400s, the Western Roman Empire succumbed to these successive waves of Germanic barbarian invasions, and there was war and chaos, and the church in the western half of the Roman Empire fell into disarray in this time. But last week we went to Ireland, Celtic Ireland, and that had never been a part of the Roman Empire, and they didn't experience those waves of Germanic barbarians invading. And that the church there was not in disarray. And they developed customs and expressions of their faith that were unique to their culture. And we read about, or we talked about how they preserved lots of books and how they engaged in a lot of mission work. Okay, tonight I want to go back to Rome and look at how the church there recovered. And I want to do that through the story of a few people. So first of all, Benedict of Nursia. So Benedict was born in Italy, in Nursia, in 480. This is exactly the time of those Germanic warriors invading, exactly the time of all this turbulence and chaos when this man Benedict was born. He was born to privilege in a well-to-do family. And as a youth, he traveled from Nursia, which is, if you can see my cursor here, here in Italy, and he traveled to Rome to study. And as would be expected of someone in his class, in his social class, he would study and he would contribute to society through probably law or politics. But eventually, and he came from a Christian home, and eventually he realized that he couldn't tolerate the lifestyle of his well-educated companions in Rome in school. So he quit school and he left Rome. He abandoned his wealth, his inheritance, his worldly status, his parents, the potential comforts of a wife. He left it all for God. And he said his only desire was to please the Lord. So he left Rome. He traveled to Enfide, this town here, and he settled near a church. But eventually he left even there and he went to Sabacchio, and he settled in a cave next to the Anio River. And he became he was kind of a hermit. But he became a bit of a celebrity. And many men who were hungry for comfort and peace in this turbulent society, in this chaotic world, they went to his cave to hear him teach. And he gathered a bunch of followers. So he decided that he should house these followers that were kind of leaving their own homes. So he left his cave and he established 13 monasteries, including one at Monte Cassino, which you can see down here near the Adriatic Sea. So he founded these 13 monasteries. This is a picture of Monte Cassino. Up in the upper left, it was bombed in World War II. And down in the bottom right is what it looks like now. It was rebuilt. Okay. So he built these monasteries, and as war ravaged Italy, his monasteries and his monks welcomed in guests, and they gave money and food to the poor. So they were a real place of sanctuary in this turbulent time. And and at this time, he began to work out a rule for how the monks would live together in this monastery. So they just sort of got together and started, but he started to think out, like, what are the basic rules of how we should live together? He started to work that out. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard this, but I'm going to speak about it quite a bit tonight. And actually through the Middle Ages, all the Middle Ages, Benedict's rule of life. He also called it the little rule for beginners, which I love. So it's not just a list of do's and don'ts for living in his monasteries. It was actually a blueprint for living an ordered and celibate form of Christian life. And he wrote this in just about 50 pages, so it's not long. And his rule, I've read it, it's so interesting for it. It's wise. It has moderation. It has biblical grounding. It has flexibility, and just an interweaving of spiritual teaching and practical living. So we've talked about monks in the desert. We've talked about monks in Ireland and some severe asceticism. So he didn't call for that. Benedict's rule of life didn't call for that type of asceticism. The men coming into his monasteries were lay people. They weren't priests. And he made sure that the rule included plenty to eat. They had wine in moderation, plenty of sleep. There was work involved in their daily schedule. And what he really wanted to do was create this community of celibate Christians devoted to helping each other live out the gospel like a family. And he called it the School of the Lord's Service. And these monasteries that he created and that began to live under this rule, the little rule for beginners, were really centers of peace and learning that were so important in the upheaval of these days. Okay, and I just wanted to show you a picture, a snapshot of what his rule looked like, the daily schedule. Just point out a couple things. So they had lots of time during the day. Actually, 9 times a day, they got together to pray together, starting at 2:30 in the morning. 9 times a day, they got together to pray together, but there was also time for them to pray by themselves, time to read by themselves. Even in the summer, in the afternoon, they got a 45-minute nap where they could nap or just read. There was also periods in the morning and the afternoon where they would work the gardens or whatever it was that was required for maintaining the household that this was. And then he also made sure that they went to bed at a proper hour. It was a little earlier in the winter and it got darker earlier. So 7 o'clock, they would retire to their dormitory. So his rule is very carefully balanced. A lot of, like I said, balance of communal prayer, private prayer, reading, work. And this rule actually became the standard, the gold standard for monasteries and modern monastics. Both Catholic and Protestants use this, and they're still listening. Even today, people are still listening to his rule to see where the Holy Spirit might be leading Benedictine disciples, even today. So basically, we just have this beautiful place of calm, of peace, of family. And it was truly in response to those times of turbulence and war. And up in the top left-hand corner, there's a picture of Benedict talking to a woman named Scholastica, who was his sister, and possibly even his twin sister. And she did the same thing for women. She set up communities for women who wanted to step out of the chaos of the world. So the next man is Gregory, and we know him as Gregory the Great. He lived from 540 to 604, so the early part of the early Middle Ages. And he was a monk in a Benedictine monastery. And the church called him to be the Bishop of Rome. So every city had their own bishop or pastor. And he didn't want to leave the monastery, but eventually he did. And just to note, the Bishop of Rome from the beginning was acknowledged as having some sort of authority over other bishops of other cities, because Peter supposedly was buried in Rome, but there wasn't any concept, and I'm going to use the word pope at times, but in these early Middle Ages, there was no concept of the office of the pope or the papacy like we know it now. It was just the Bishop of Rome who kind of de facto was acknowledged as having some kind of authority. But Gregory more than anybody else, was responsible for the Roman Church hauling itself up out of the ashes in this time of political and economic upheaval. The West and the Western Church were under siege, and they were actually, the Western Church was, other than Celtic Ireland, was fighting for its survival. And the Roman Empire in the West was dealing with famine, with poverty, with population decrease, plague. And Gregory filled a leadership vacuum in a time where there was no Roman Empire, and the people who were ruling were just, tribal kings who took up the throne or whatever. But he filled a leadership vacuum, and he helped all of the people of Rome more than any emperor had done in terms of making sure that people were fed and organized and just surviving. And he was determined that he was going to revive the church as well, not just the population at large, which he did. But he had two strategies. One, he was going to head north and Romanize the churches that were existing in the British Isles. And two, he was going to evangelize those pagan tribes and draw them into an alliance with the church under Christian rule. He had immense vision. And I want you to withhold your judgments on Gregory. He's a man of his time, and he's trying to deal with the reality, his reality of his time. He has no concept of our modern worldview. So with that said, so he wanted to evangelize, remember, up in the British Isles, after Rome had pulled out of England, the Germanic tribes of the Angles and the Saxons had flowed in. They'd overrun England, and the Celtic missionaries at this same time were starting to come down from the northern direction towards the Angles and Saxons, and he was going to come up from the south. And in 595, he sent representatives to southern France, which is Gaul. He sent representatives there to purchase Anglo-Saxon slaves and bring them back to Rome to be trained as clerics or priests or religious leaders. These were people who knew the Anglo-Saxon language. So in 596, the next year, he assembled these group of men under a man named Augustine, who was a different, not the Augustine that we studied from the early church, but he assembled these 40 men and Augustine as their like team lead, and he trained them. And just before Easter in 597, he sent them to Kent in southeast England. Now, Kent had an Anglo-Saxon king named Ethelbert, and the pictures, this picture on the top right is Gregory and the team that he's training. And down at the bottom are two different representatives of these monks that he trained going into Kent, and two different images of King Ethelbert, the Anglo-Saxon King Ethelbert. And he had a wife, the queen, whose name was Bertha, and she was actually already a Christian, and she had come from across the English Channel from Gaul. She was Frankish, not Anglo-Saxon. But anyways, Ethelbert, they preached the gospel. Ethelbert quickly accepted the faith, and he was the lord or the king over Kent, over Essex, and over East Anglia. So when he converted, all of those kingdoms that he ruled over, those little areas that he ruled over, they converted. Remember, king converts, the people convert. And so now 3 out of the 12 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that are existing at the time come under Christian rule, or the rule of the Roman Church. And that man, Augustine, the team lead, so to speak, he was made the archbishop in England, sort of like the level above a bishop. He was made the archbishop, and he built a headquarters at Canterbury. And that Canterbury still exists today. in England. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, you might have heard that phrase, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the principal leader over the Church of England.
Yes.
To this day.
Mm-hmm.
So Gregory's missionaries, they started in southeast England in Kent, but they headed north. And remember, there's already a rich Christian tradition that's in England that's been brought there by the Irish missionaries, bringing their Celtic customs and practices and expressions of faith. And they didn't appreciate the Roman Church coming along and imposing their tradition on an already existing indigenous church, and tensions arose. So these tensions were centered on two key issues. One was, when is the date of Easter? So the Celtic tradition and the Roman tradition had different ways of calculating when to celebrate Easter. And then some other church matters that they disagreed on. And then the other big issue was, what should be the attitude towards the Bishop of Rome? Like, what level of authority is he supposed to have? And there was a difference of opinion between the Roman Church and the Celtic Church. Remember, the Celtic Church was not very fond of hierarchy, so they didn't have a great attitude towards the submitting to the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Anyways, the tensions grew to a head, and in 664, a council was called by King Oswy. So he was an Anglo-Saxon of Northumbria, which is in northern England. He called this council because he got so exasperated by the two sides of the two wings of the church arguing, and this friction. And plus, he didn't know when to celebrate Easter. It was confusing to him. So the king held a council at Whitby, and at the Abbey of Whitby, which is the remains of it there on the left on the screen. And he got a bunch of the church leaders together to hash it out. They call this the Synod of Whitby, and that was in 644 AD. And this was after Gregory the Great had passed on. This was after his lifetime. But they had this council, and King Oswy, since he called the council, he had sort of a, important vote in the matter. And he decided that since the Bishop of Rome was a spiritual descendant of Peter, that it was better to be on the side of the apostle who holds the keys. So that was the formal moment that the British church was Romanized. But on the ground, it took another 100 years for the actual impact of that to be felt. But in the Council of Whitby, the tension or the conflict between the Celtic Church and their traditions and the Roman Church and their traditions, the Roman Church won out. Now, over time, it wasn't all bad. So over time, the order and the efficiency and the stability and the administrative skill and all those kinds of things of the Roman Church combined with this rich, creative, emotional tradition of the Celts. And together they produced this tremendous missionary impulse that spread into all of continental Europe. So that was a good outcome of those two traditions coming together. Before I move on, I want to just mention one woman named Hilda, or Hild, of Whitby. And she was the abbess of this abbey in Whitby where they held that council. And I mentioned Hilda of Whitby, first of all, to bring a woman into the story, but also because I want to bring in an Anglo-Saxon. The Anglo-Saxons, when they embraced Christianity, a beautiful Christian tradition, a rich tradition developed in England. And we've talked about various Roman people, and we talked about various Celtic people, but Hilda was an Anglo-Saxon. So she was born into a pagan Anglo-Saxon tribe. And when her King Edwin, was converted and baptized she was too. Again, king converts, whole tribe converts, and she was the king's great niece. And when she converted at age 13. When she was 33, she entered into a convent to be a nun, and later she founded this abbey at Whitby. And the Whitby was this, again, it's in northern England, and it's a Celtic-style double monastery where they're both men and women, and members live in separate houses, but they worship together. Remember, Bridget was the abbess at that same type of abbey in Ireland. Okay, so Hilda is described as a woman of great energy, a skillful administrator, and a teacher. And she gained such a reputation for wisdom that kings and princes came to seek her advice on matters. And she also had a concern for ordinary folks. And I love this story. On the right here, on the right, there's a monument here to a poet by the name of Cadman. And he was an animal caretaker at this abbey at Whitby. And he originally, he didn't know anything about songs or poetry or, how to write music or anything like that. But as the story goes, one night in a dream, he learned how to compose, and Hilda found out about it, and she encouraged him. And he went on to become a zealous monk and an inspirational Christian poet. And he's actually the earliest English poet whose name that we have. So Hilda, Anglo-Saxon, a great woman of God, wise and a great influence, and Cadman, the first Christian poet whose name we have. And where do we get all this information about Christianity in these early Middle Ages in England? Well, it comes from this guy here. He's a monk by the name of, they've called him the Venerable Bede. So Bede wrote a book called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, or the Church History of the English People. And he lived in 673 to 734. So he is writing about stuff that happened really not that far from the time that he was living in. And this has been a tremendous, we have the whole book. It's been kept preserved all these many centuries, and it's a tremendous resource. I've only read parts of it. I haven't read the whole thing. I'd love to read the whole thing someday. Okay, moving on in time. Let's check out what's going on in Gaul. So we've seen what Gregory's done with missionary work up into England, and we've seen a rich between Ireland and missionaries and Gregory. We've seen this wonderful Christian tradition developing in England. But now we're going to go back over to Gaul. We're going to cross over to continental Europe. So Gaul, and you can see it right here on this map here, this area here that looks like approximately where France is today. And I mentioned before that Gaul had been conquered by the Romans, by Julius Caesar. And so it became part of the Roman Empire. Christianity spread there, and a Germanic tribe called the Franks lived there. Now, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the disarray of the church, the Christianity in Gaul was also floundering as well. Okay, and it needed to be quote unquote re-Christianized, and this was done by both Celtic missionaries that came down and also Roman missionaries. So the kings there in Gaul, the Frankish king, so Gaul is the place, and Franks are the people who live there. Franks is FR, that's where we get France, I think. So the Frankish kings started to get more and more powerful. A couple of pictures of them, images of them down here on the bottom. They started to get more and more powerful, and we begin to see, again, an intertwining of spiritual and political power again. But it's going to look very, very different than what happened with the Roman emperors, starting with Constantine. It's going to look very different than that. And the story of the missionary Boniface gives us some insight into this intertwining. So here's Boniface on the right. And Boniface was Anglo-Saxon. He was born in England. He lived in the second half of the 600s into the 700s. And the church in Rome commissioned Boniface as a bishop to the Germans, to those Germanic tribes. And off he went to take the gospel to all these various Germanic tribes up north. You can see up here on the map, Germanica. That's sort of the general area where these tribes were. And he was a busy man because not only was he commissioned to go as a missionary off into these German tribes, he was also asked to go into Gaul and help them as they're straightening out the church there, the church that had fallen into disarray. So he's got these two jobs, and he combined his efforts by getting support for his mission work from the Frankish kings. And they were very happy to give him help because they wanted an in into this territory. They had their eye on it in terms of geographical, territorial, political expansion. So their motives weren't as pure as Boniface's, but the church was happy to turn a blind eye to this because they were thankful for this military support of these Frankish rulers against the Muslims, because at this time the Muslims were getting at the doorstep in the East and in Spain. And we're going to talk a lot more about the interaction, the Christian-Muslim interaction through history when we talk about the Crusades in the High Middle Ages in a few weeks. Anyways, back to this Frankish church. So there's really a revival and some wonderful things which we're going to talk about next week that happened in Gaul with the Frankish people, the Frankish rulers, some beautiful things, but we're going to get through the political stuff tonight, which isn't as pleasant. But one dynasty of the Frankish kings, called the Carolingians, expanded their kingdom to an incredible territory. And you see it here on the map in this dark tan. They conquered and took over that large of an area. And this incredible territory wouldn't be equaled again until the 19th century with Napoleon, and then the 20th century with Hitler.
Wow.
So at this time, the kings and the church in Rome worked together, and they brought about an alliance of the throne and the altar. So throne would be temporal rulers, altar would be church rulers. And we see an emerging kind of dual authority of the church and the authority of the temporal rulers. And these are the roots of something called Christendom. And that's a really important word. It's going to be incredibly important for the rest of the history of Christianity, including up till today. So I just wanted to look at what that word is. So Christendom, it's a vision of a completely Christian society where temporal rulers and church together wield authority over citizens. The Christian clergy wield political authority, and the temporal rulers make laws about what happens in the church. So it's this total joining of church and state. And it's a world where God rules over all, a theocracy. And government institutions, everything are spread through with Christian doctrines. So this relationship of king or temporal ruler and church intertwined is symbolized really graphically by the coronation of King Charlemagne. He was one of the Carolingian Frankish kings. And there are a lot of artistic images of this, but this particular picture is from a 19th century painting. But in this picture, we see it's the year 800, and Charlemagne is being crowned by the Pope Pope Leo. It's at a Christmas Mass, and this is in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And the Pope is crowning Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor. Now, there hasn't been an emperor in Rome for 325 years. And there was such a mixture of church authority and temporal ruler authority going on here. So the church is the kingmaker, but after the crowning, Pope Leo illustrates his subservience by bowing flat on his face in front of King Charlemagne. Leo had anointed Charlemagne with the very same oil that's used to anoint bishops. And that title, Holy Roman Emperor, is kind of pretentious. I would say it's not very holy, not very Roman. He's a Frank, of Germanic descent, and it's barely an empire. They've got this huge territory, but it's just really held together pretty loosely, not anything like the Roman Empire was held together. It may be a pretentious title, but symbolically, it is huge that there is a Holy Roman Emperor. And this relationship between the Pope and the emperor or the temporal rulers is one of the main themes of the whole medieval period. We're going to come back to this several times as we finish the Middle Ages this week, next week, and then the 3 weeks after. Actually, the rest of this class is the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages. But this relationship between the Pope and the Emperor, huge main theme. And I want you to think about a scale where there's the throne or the temporal ruler on one side and the altar or the church on the other side. And sometimes the throne is more powerful and has the weight, and sometimes the church is more powerful and the weight goes in the other direction. Now, Charlemagne, a few years before he was crowned as Holy Roman Emperor, he wrote a letter to Pope Leo. And I just want to read this. This is his understanding of this alliance. And I pardon my modern greeting here, but dear Leo, this is Charlemagne speaking to the Bishop of Rome. It is our part, meaning the temporal ruler's part, with the help of divine holiness, to defend by arms strength the holy church of Christ everywhere from the onslaught of pagans and the ravages of infidels. And infidels would always mean the Muslims. And to strengthen within our kingdom the knowledge of the Catholic faith. That is the part of kings. It is your part, the part of the church, Most Holy Father, to help our armies with your hands lifted up to God like Moses, so that by your intercession and by the leadership and gift of God, the Christian people may everywhere and always have victory over the enemies of his holy name, and that the name of our Lord Jesus Christ may be glorified throughout the world. Sincerely, Charlemagne. Well, after his coronation, Charlemagne gets known at his court as David. And what we've got developing here is this picture of sacral kingship, like the king is the Lord's anointed. So this is one of probably the strangest things that became important during this period. And here's, I brought this up because it's another manifestation of this connection between the temporal rulers and the church. So a relic usually consists of the part of the physical remains of a saint or a holy person, and some object associated with the person. Like, for instance, the bones of an apostle, like Peter's bones, or the piece of the cross of Jesus, or the lance that pierced Jesus' side, or the tooth of Anthony of the desert. And these aren't just mementos for these people. These are believed to, and remember, they have a totally different understanding of they have a totally different understanding of everything than we do. But they understood these as providing some kind of a spiritual link between the living and the dead, and that they had power. They had power to heal, to bring you success in battle, success as a king, as a church, to encourage crops. And every church had relics. And every king had relics, and the more the better. And the relic par excellence, which we've mentioned, was Peter the Apostle's bones in Rome, and which really supported Rome's claim to fame and authority. All the kings had relics. They had them in their crowns, in their thrones. Charlemagne's throne, I couldn't see it on that picture that I showed you, but supposedly it had little cubby holes in his throne where they put relics because they believed that they had power. And in the relic collections of the kings was believed the safety of his kingdom. And so as we saw tonight, this pattern of kingship beginning to form, and the church takes on the role of the kingmaker. We saw that. And they're the prophetic supporter of the king. And they're also the dealer in relics to make the king great. So there's where the connection comes in. And again, we get this concept of sacral kingship and the kings being increasingly untouchable. One of the key scriptures that's used over and over again in this time is from 1 Samuel 24, where David says, touch not the Lord's anointed, when he's being pursued by Saul and he has a chance to kill him. And he says, touch not the Lord's anointed. And so they're taking that idea of anointed sacred king very seriously in this new idea of kingship in association with the church. So the bishops are the kingmakers, they're powerful advisors to the kings, and they have key roles in regional government, offering prayers for the success of the kings and providing relics. It's almost like they become brokers of relics. And with the rise of this rise of the bishops in power is connected with the rise of kings in this second half of these early Middle Ages, and relics is part of that connection. This is from one of my sources, just a quote that I want to read about Charlemagne's legacy of this alliance of church and state. Charlemagne could not foresee that his attempts to unite a fractured society would have such a far-reaching impact. Though his dynasty petered out, his idea that church and state belonged naturally together and that together they would hold back the barbarians from the gates lasted long after Leo set the crown on his head that fateful Christmas day. And then there's some more in the quote about the rest of the Middle Ages, and even after the Reformation, and even with Protestants and what they set up. And he ended that paragraph, this author, he said, it lasted, this legacy of Charlemagne lasted as Christianity spread across the Atlantic to a new land, the United States, that had no state church, but saw the state itself as carrying out God's mission on earth. So let's look at the major consequences of this alliance of the church and state. So first, it produced this new idea of sacral kingship, which I've already started to mention, but that kings for all the rest of the Middle Ages, this was how kings were going to be considered. And kings set themselves above the bishops and the priests in the government of the Christian community. And during this early period, on the scale, the weight is on the side of the throne, and the throne is more powerful. And we're going to see this shift in the 11th century, where the church becomes more powerful. So we've got this idea that the kings are sacred, that they're anointed of God for rulership over Christendom. A second major consequence was that these Frankish kings began issuing what are called capitularies. So basically, they're sets of rules or laws. There was no legislative body; there were kings, but they issued these capitularies, and they regulated both secular and religious matters. These are coming from the king, rules about secular matters and religious matters. For instance, in the capitulary of 789, Charlemagne said that schools should be established at every monastery, that they should copy scriptures in the monasteries. And he said what the curriculum should be at these monastery schools. The king is setting the curriculum. He prohibited work on Sunday. He made attendance at worship service or mass mandatory. Think about it. The temporal ruler is creating these laws. And even the life of the monks was affected. So before this time, every monastery, and there were lots of them, they basically did what seemed right in the eyes of the abbot or the head of the monastery, or the abbess if it was women. But Charlemagne's son, whose name was Louis the Pious, and he really was pious, in 817, he issued a capitulary that said all monasteries have to follow the rule of Benedict. Now, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it came from the temporal ruler, not from the church. And he sent like government officials around to the monasteries to check up on them and make sure that they were following the rule of Benedict. So the oversight wasn't from the church itself. More monks were becoming priests at this time, so more masses could be said. And we're going to talk a lot about the mass next week, but masses could be said. So they needed more sacramentaries, which are these books that had all the words that the priest would say and sing in the course of the mass or the worship service. And so in another act of centralization, Charlemagne issued a capitulary that there should be one deluxe sacramentary that all the priests would use. So we're getting this centralization of the character of devotion in the church based on the laws that the king hands down. Now, it's also interesting in this sacramentary, Charlemagne insisted on something called the corporal presence. So he insists on the idea that the Eucharist, bread and wine, is the real body and blood of Christ. And we're going to examine the Eucharist much more next week and beyond. This is something that we started talking about Eucharist, practically day one, but it's something that we're going to talk about for weeks to come. Another consequence, excuse me, we're going to see the formation of what will later be known as the Papal States. In 755, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, called on the Frankish rulers to help him because tribes in Lombard tribes is another type of Germanic tribe. There were all kinds of them, but Lombard tribes up here were invading down here into Rome. And so the Pope called on the Frankish kings up in Gaul, which would be somewhere up here, to come and help him. And King Pepin, and this was Charlemagne's father, sends an army to assist Rome, and he defeats 22 cities in northern Italy, and he sends the keys to all of them to the Pope. That's something they did. If they conquered a city, you got the key and could do with it what you wanted. But he sent the keys to all of these 22 cities to the Pope. And now the Pope is becoming legally confirmed as a territorial ruler, the ruler of the Papal States of Italy. And we begin to see the papacy acting and living and operating as kings. So we've got this mashup here, what the kings are doing in terms of the church and what the church is doing in terms of political things. And another outcome of this, which contributed to the separation of the Western Church and the Eastern Church. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how that all happened in a couple of weeks, in a few weeks. We're going to outline how that separation came about. But one of the things that happened was the eastern part of the Roman Empire hadn't fallen. They had an emperor. And now here's the Pope crowning, crowning a Frankish king, Holy Roman Emperor. So there's another clash here with Rome. Like there is a Roman emperor. What's going on here? But we'll go back to that a little bit more. But I just wanted to share one other thing that contributed to this struggle of leadership between the Western Church and headquartered in Rome and the Eastern Church headquartered in Constantinople, which is Istanbul now, but Rome and Constantinople. So the Roman Church claimed authority because of being the place where Peter's bones are buried. And I wanted to talk about relics tonight, but I don't think we have time. So I'll save that for next week. But they said that Peter's bones are buried here, and we're the sons of Peter, so to speak, and we should have the authority. But also, besides Peter's bones, they also claimed something called the donation of Constantine. And I mentioned this a little bit when we were talking about Constantine, but this document was supposedly written in the 4th century by the Emperor Constantine, where he gave the Western Pope authority over the city of Rome and all the Western regions. So this donation of Constantine was this crazy claim that the Bishop of Rome was the ruler over all of this region. And this was, and this picture on the right here, this fresco, I showed you that also. And this is just an image from the 13th century showing Constantine donating to the church. That's a reference to the donation of Constantine. So this document carried a lot of weight and a lot of power, and it was accepted as a genuine document underpinning the authority of the Pope in Rome. But it was written in the 8th century, not the 4th. And it was written actually in the 750s so that the Pope could use it when he went to the Frankish kings to get their help against those Lombard tribes. When he went to Pepin to negotiate with him. And this document wasn't discovered to be a forgery until 1440. But at this point in time, we're in the 700s and 800s right now. We can start to talk now. And somebody asked this question last week, I believe it was, about the existence of the Roman Catholic Church. We can now start to talk confidently of there being a Roman Catholic Church, and we can start to talk about the office of the papacy. But at what cost? In the last consequence that I wanted to share with you, I feel like this alliance of the church and throne and this ascendancy of the Bishop of Rome and the office of papacy, I believe that there was a cost to the purity of the church, because one of the consequences of this alliance was that the church became associated with oppression and violence. And one example of this is something Charlemagne did. Now, and I want you to remember that Charlemagne is a very complicated character. And he also, from all the records, appeared to be very devout and did many good things. And we shouldn't judge whether or not he had a genuine faith or not. He was a man of his time, and it was a warring time. And unfortunately, he used Christianity as a means of subduing. He wanted to create an empire. He used Christianity as a means of subduing the Saxons. You can see up here on the right top, this Germanic kingdom up here, the Saxons, which is in modern Germany now. So anyways, when he targeted these Saxon tribes, he used the gospel, and he asked them to repent, and he killed them if they resisted. And on one occasion, 4,500 Saxons resisted Charlemagne and the gospel, and they were all killed in one single day of slaughter. And this is something that the church is associated with. So this is just one small example, sad, but just one example of the church getting caught up in the machinations of the world and being subject ultimately to the authority of these political rulers. The political rulers have the weight right now. Another example of this was 100 years after this picture, after the Frankish king's power had sort of waned, the new Holy Roman Emperor was someone up in Germany by the name of Otto I. And he made the current Pope, during the time of his reign, he made the Pope promise not to elect any new popes without his, Otto's son's permission. So that's some pretty hefty interference in the life of the church. It's really a pretty grim situation, indeed, for the life of the church at this time. And next week, before we leave the Dark Ages, we'll leave the political scene and we'll talk about some things on the ground with the people, and we'll see some beautiful things. Don't lose hope. And next week, I'll wrap up with a summary of the church as it emerges from these dark ages, and the good and the bad and the ugly and the beautiful. But we can't leave tonight this political scene without saying a few words about the Vikings. It looks like I have just the right amount of time. So I always thought of the Vikings as early, but they're starting their raids in the late 700s, which is the exact same time as Charlemagne is doing his conquering and expanding. And these Vikings, I'm sure this isn't new to anybody, but they're warriors, seamen. They're called the Norsemen. They're from Scandinavia, which is now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And they raided and they pirated and they traded and they settled throughout parts of Europe from the late 8th to the late 11th centuries. And they sailed westward to Britain, to Iceland, to Greenland, all the way to North America. Now, I can't imagine getting to North America from Scandinavia in a longboat. These were, in one aspect, these were amazing people. And here's a map of their travels, the blue line, their travels. And you can see where Scandinavia is here, but you can see how they went all over the place. They went west all the way over here to the, across the Atlantic, all the way. And nobody's sure exactly why they did this, why they left home, but there was one idea that there was a lot of population growth, and that's, in those days, if you have population growth, it makes you want to expand and get new lands, because you're so dependent on lands for food. But that's one idea. But in their travels, they even got to Russia. So these are pictures from the Hagia Sophia, which was a huge Christian church built in Constantinople. It's now a mosque in Istanbul, Turkey. But in the upstairs area of the Hagia Sophia, there is Viking graffiti. I love this. So these are amazing people, but incredibly feared. They're pagan worshipers. They worship the gods, like, these gods, Thor, the god of thunder, and Odin, the god of the spear, and Frey, the god of sexual pleasure. And they attacked even monasteries, and they raped nuns, and they raped monks. This is an image of them plundering and attacking the monastery at Lindisfarne, which is in northern England. And Lindisfarne I just want to show you this one little beautiful picture here. These are some images from something called the Lindisfarne Gospel. So this is another one of those illuminated texts, but this is actually from Anglo-Saxon Christianity, not Irish. But anyways, that was there in the Lindisfarne Monastery, but they managed to get it out of there, so it wasn't destroyed. Thankfully, it wasn't destroyed. Anyways, these Vikings, they attacked the monasteries, etc. One contemporary source likened their attacks to stinging hornets and ravenous wolves. They just plundered and slaughtered. The Vikings killed whoever they wanted in slaughter of epic proportions. And it's a long and interesting story, but when the peace was made with the Vikings, it was accompanied everywhere by the conversion of these groups to Christianity. It's just astonishing. And the grandsons of slaughtering Vikings, here's a couple of examples. Guthrith was a grandson of a slaughtering Viking, became a Christian. He was buried with full Christian rites in a Christian cemetery. This is Westminster, or York Minster, excuse me, not Westminster, York Minster in England. And then another grandson on the left here is Oswald. And in the 900s, he was a great monastic reformer. We're going to talk about monastic reform in a couple of weeks. And so really just 3 generations from the axe and the hammer to the cross, and just a rapid assimilation of these incredible people into Christianity. And I've heard it said that Christianity is only 1 generation away from extinction because of the fact that you don't inherit the faith of your parents or your grandparents, but you're converted by your own faith. And couldn't the reverse be said as well, that Christianity is only ever 1 generation away from radically transforming the earth? And I think the Vikings give me hope. This powerful example of the Vikings give me hope. And all this with the Vikings being Christianized and etc., it's all happening in a period that's also full of this politics and debauchery in the church. So we're going to wrap up the early Middle Ages next week, and we're going to talk about how they worshiped. We're going to talk about the sacraments. We're going to talk about also a renaissance of learning that happened. And we're going to look at the good and the light and the beauty of the dark Middle Ages. It wasn't completely dark.